We find in nature things that are possible to be and not possible to be, since they are found to be generated and corrupted. But it is impossible for these always to exist, for that which cannot be at some time is not. Therefore, if everything cannot be, then at one time there was nothing in existence. So what is asserted here is that 1. There are contingent things, and 2. Contingent things begin and cease to exist. Also 3. If all things are contingent, then there was a time at which nothing existed. Now, this passage is much maligned, and there are two rather obvious problems with it. First, 3 does not seem to be implied by the understanding of contingent things as things that begin and cease to exist. So, first, let us accept that since contingent things begin and cease to exist, then necessarily the temporal interval of their existence is embedded in a larger interval. So, there is a time before they were generated and a time when they have ceased to exist. But what this implies is that for every individual contingent thing, there is some time at which it does not exist. But from this it does not follow that therefore there is some time at which no contingent thing exists. For simply suppose that there are infinitely many contingent things whose existence temporally overlaps and yet completely covers an infinite timeline. The assertion seems to be based on a quantifier shift fallacy, meaning from 4, for every x, if x is contingent, then for every time t, x possibly does not exist, it follows that 5, for every time t, it holds that possibly there exists no x such that x is contingent. But it doesn't follow that 6, necessarily there is a time t for which it holds that no x such that x is contingent exists. But it's also even worse, for suppose that only contingent things possibly exist, then suppose for reductio that 6 holds. Then there is a time t at which nothing at all exists. This is rather questionable, for such an empty time presupposes a quasi-Newtonian conception of time as absolute, which is rather controversial. But one could of course modify 6 in a way to accommodate the modern view that there is no such thing as an empty time devoid of concrete objects. 7. Necessarily there is a time t for which it holds that there is no time t star earlier than t, such that there exists some x such that x is contingent. And yet, to deduce 7 from 2, we need to make an additional assumption, at least that's how it seems to me. First, if we assume that during any temporal interval only finitely many contingent things can exist, then since they're all generated, meaning they begin to exist at some time, it seems this implies that there is some time t before which there are no contingent things in existence. With only finitely many contingent things, it seems that we cannot construct an infinite timeline, so to speak. But that also seems insufficient because we haven't properly and carefully defined the meaning of the term beginning to exist. If we take beginning to exist in a strong sense, then it's not to be equivocated with generation. For if something x or substance s is generated sometime t, it means that there is no time t or instant t star directly prior to t such that x or s exists. Think of something that leaps in and out of existence so that it continually re-emerges. Now such a thing can still begin to exist in a stronger sense, namely that there is a first time at which it is generated. Technically speaking then, since time may be continuous, it is also incorrect to speak of some time t star directly or immediately prior to some time t. Rather, to define generation we need to be a bit more precise. 8. Something x is generated at some time tn if and only if a. There is some time t and a time t star earlier than t such that there is some time interval I spanning from t star to t, and x exists at some time tn in I, and there exists some time tm earlier than tn in I at which it does not exist, or b. X exists at tn and there is no time tm earlier than tn. Whereas in a strong sense, 9. Something x begins to exist at some time tn if and only if x exists at tn and there is no time tm earlier than tn at which it exists. But now, if reemergence is allowed, meaning that a thing can cease to exist only to reappear on the timeline, we should ask the question what 2 really states. 2. Contingent things begin and cease to exist. But surely if contingency merely means that, as 4 states, for every x, if x is contingent, then for every time t, x possibly does not exist, then 2 can be fully captured by 2 star, contingent things are generated and cessated, meaning they can pop in and out of existence, whereas contingency doesn't seem to imply an absolute first and last moment of their existence. But then, suppose we have 2 contingent things that go in and out of existence continually, then it can still cover even an infinite timeline. So, from 2 star it doesn't follow that a merely finite amount of contingent things that exist implies that there could not be a non-finite duration during which contingent things exist. Or one could make use of the following trick as Robert Modal does and claim the following. 10. Everything that begins to exist at some time and ceases to exist at some time exists only for a finite period of time, such that the overall lifespan of contingent things is finite in length or duration. But then the question is, what does that still have to do with contingency in and of itself? Very little, it seems. Now, what does this tell us about Aquinas' reasoning? Well, if we reconstruct thought, then there are two parallel analyses. The first is a contemplation of the modal status of ordinary objects, things that go in and out of existence, things of which it is true that at some times they possibly do not exist. But from this it's supposedly deduced that if only such contingent things exist, then it cannot be the case that their existence fills a complete non-finite time span. Well, the second analysis concerns the lifespan and the going in and out of existence of ordinary objects, from which it is likewise deduced that their existence cannot cover an infinite time span. But it seems to me that both analyses do not succeed in strongly implying the desired conclusions. The modal contingency of ordinary objects does not imply the temporal limitation of the contingent realm as a whole, whereas the emergence and cessation of ordinary objects likewise fails to imply the same. To be fair to Aquinas, though, maybe the inference that he wished to propose was that observation of the natural realm, the realm of generation and corruption, should lead one to conclude that the nature of individual things applies to what is nowadays called the realm of contingent things in its entirety, namely that it follows the same pattern and is therefore not only modally but also temporally limited.